After 2 days of meetings with Kim Jong Un, President Trump left Vietnam early this morning after walking away from a potential deal with North Korea. The two leaders began negotiations yesterday during the second summit in the last 8 months aimed at denuclearizing North Korea. Kim came to Hanoi seeking economic relief in return for negotiations on the country's nuclear program. That issue ended up preventing an agreement. Still, President Trump called the summit productive, but he explained why he ultimately walked away from a deal with Kim Jong Un.
I think our relationship is very strong, but at this time we had some options, and at this time we decided not to do any of the options, and we'll see where that goes. But it was a very interesting 2 days, and I think actually it was a very productive 2 days, but sometimes you have to walk, and this was just one of those times. Basically, they wanted the sanctions lifted in their entirety, and we couldn't do that. They were willing to denuke a large portion of the areas that we wanted, but we couldn't give up all of the sanctions for that.
All right, so for more on this, we want to bring in Christina Ruffini and Isaac Stone-Fish joining me now. Christina, you are in Hanoi, and you are part of our CBS News State Department division. You're one of our reporters. So listen, I want to start though with Christina. You've been there. We know that the two leaders were scheduled to sign a joint agreement, but that plan was called off after talks broke down, particularly about lifting all of the sanctions. What more do we know about this round of negotiations?
Right. So one of the stumbling blocks even going into these negotiations was, what is the definition of denuclearization? And in order to define something, you have to know what it is. So what the United States needed from the North Koreans is for them to disclose where their nuclear weapons are, what their programs are, how much nuclear fuel they had, and what their capacity was. And apparently that wasn't something that they were willing to do. That seems like that was one of the biggest stumbling blocks. And during that press conference, President Trump ceded the microphone to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to talk a little bit about the details. And he said they had an issue with the disclosure of all those different facilities and weapons, and they had a timing and sequence issue, and it just couldn't be resolved. And from there, the talks broke down. They stopped the summit a couple hours early, and there was supposed to be a lunch. There was supposed to be this joint signing statement, and none of it happened. It all just we got a notice that the press conference had been moved up, and that was it. That was all she wrote.
Yeah, and shortly after that, the president was on a plane headed back here to the U.S. But the president did, you sort of think that there was progress made, and one of the areas that he identified as progress being made is an agreement as to what the definition of denuclearization actually means for both parties. Can you remind us just where the agreement is and what progress has been made?
Well, the White House is saying there is progress whenever you can get someone like Kim Jong Un to the negotiating table. And it's progress that he's here, that he's willing to open up and even disclose these things, and that they did meet. They did have a full day of meetings. They had the handshake and then the dinner, and then they said it was a productive meeting. And at the start of the day, Kim answered questions from journalists and said he thought it was going, he said, I will do everything I can to deliver a good outcome today. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, that outcome didn't happen. Now, President Trump did say he was a little circumspect when he was asked if he thought there would be another summit. He said, I hope, but it may not be for a very long time. So we'll have to see what this means. Well, other administrations have tried and failed to get North Korea to denuclearize. We're not saying that this is a failure yet, but it certainly wasn't the success that the president wanted here in Hanoi.
Okay, so then ultimately, Isaac, what sort of impact do you think this Hanoi summit will have on diplomatic relations?
It will certainly change diplomatic relations, and I think the two sides were feeding off this positive feeling, and everything just keeps getting better and better and better. And now it seems like we're going to have a lull or a stalling, and perhaps, though hopefully not, tensions could increase between the U.S. and North Korea, especially if North Korea does something as provocative as testing a nuclear weapon or a missile.
The president has said on a number of occasions when sort of identifying positives when it comes to meeting with Kim Jong Un, is that, since the last summit in Singapore, our hostages, he uses the word hostages, have been returned. And, every time he says that, you think of Otto Warmbier, who, yes, had been imprisoned in Korea and came back, but he came back in a vegetative state and ultimately did not survive. The president was asked about that, and he said that he believed Kim Jong Un's version of what happened. I just want to play some of that sound.
I don't believe that he would have allowed that to happen. It just wasn't to his advantage to allow that to happen. Those prisons are rough. They're rough places, and bad things happened. But I really don't believe that he was, I don't believe he knew about it.
So what was your takeaway from that?
So I think, and I sort of hate to say this, but I think Trump's making a good point. So it would not be in North Korea's advantage to have that happen to Otto Warmbier. And I think what a lot of experts believe is that Warmbier tried to commit suicide, faced with a long prison sentence and feeling very hopeless. And I think we have to really differentiate the treatment that Kim Jong Un and North Korea's leaders place to its own people and to Americans. They're absolutely horrific to their own people. It's one of the worst countries for human rights. There's thousands of North Korean political prisoners who are suffering really badly, but Americans are treated very, very gingerly, very carefully when they're imprisoned in North Korea. So it's a very, very different experience for Americans and for North Koreans.
Oh, okay. So, Christina, listen, Kim Jong Un took a question from a foreign journalist for the first time. You mentioned that, answering an American journalist about whether he was confident about the talks. How significant is that he was willing to sort of open himself up there to not a pre-planned or pre-scripted questioning by, you know, American journalists? As you told us, you guys got kicked out of the hotel almost because you were going to be in the same hotel as him.
And there was retribution for reporters who shouted questions at the two leaders on the first day. So the fact that Kim is not upset by this now, and he's even kind of playing along, and, you know, as the reporters were being ushered out, they were shouting questions, which we like to do because we're obnoxious. And a lot of times the principal in the room won't answer those questions, and Kim, you know, wanted to answer the questions. So you get the impression that he's understanding the way this whole media globalization thing works. He knows he's on the world stage. He's been watching President Trump, and he's learning. And I also wanted to touch on that point with President Trump talking about Otto Warmbier. The other thing that's really interesting about that is, once again, we have the President of the United States saying that he's taking the word of a dictator at face value. And this is not the first time we've seen him do that. We've seen him do that with the Saudis, with Jamal Khashoggi, and we've seen him do that with Putin with other issues where he said, you know, I believe them, they looked me in the eye, and I'm taking them at their word. So whether or not, you know, it's a good point about how Americans are treated in North Korea, whether or not he knew, I think it's interesting that the President is willing to just take that at face value and not need any more investigation and not be at all skeptical of a man who has a pretty terrible human rights record in his own country.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it's a little bit part of a pattern, his reaction to Kim Jong Un. So listen, Isaac, the president says we could have another summit very soon, or it could be a very long time, as the president likes to do. Show both sides in the same answer. So where does that leave us in terms of the path moving forward?
I think if the United States continues to insist on denuclearization and the North Korean side continues to say, okay, none of that until sanctions relief, then we could be for rockier times ahead. I don't want to say we'll be back to 2017 when it was fire and fury like the world has ever seen, but
Rocket Man, little Rocket Man.
Exactly. We could start moving towards that kind of language. I mean, and it would be another stunning reversal because, several months ago, Trump said that he and Kim Jong Un fell in love.
Yes, we do remember that. Isaac, Christina, thank you so much, guys.